everyone to today's hour-long bridge event. As Ashley was saying, this is the first bridge event of the year and the first one of our new contract period. And I'm Jessica Bailey, a researcher with the REL Northeastern Islands and part of the Urban School Improvement Alliance team from our previous REL contract. And as Ashley mentioned, the report that we're going to be discussing today was conducted with the Urban School Improvement Alliance, or USIA as we refer to it. And many of the stakeholders from that alliance found this report very useful, and I'm sure that you will as well. So the agenda for today is we are doing the welcome and introductions now, and then we'll have 3 parts. The first part will focus on understanding what we can learn by examining disciplinary data. The second part will be discussing different methods for doing data checks and looking at the data in various ways. And the third section will present some additional analytic methods for studying disciplinary data. We'll also have a discussant at the end providing a state-level perspective, and we'll have time at the end for questions. So please, throughout the presentation today, feel free to put your questions into the chat box, and my colleague Kayleen Gould will be pulling those over into a holding area so that we can answer those questions at the facilitated Q&A at the end. So we have a couple of goals for the meeting today. We'd first like to help participants build their understanding of how student-level disciplinary data analysis relates to issues of equity and student outcomes, which is very relevant today. And also explore how researchers design and conduct analyses, including calculations to address core questions. And lastly, we want to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities for collecting, analyzing, and using student-level disciplinary data. During the event, we're going to hear from the report's authors, including Dr. Anthony Petrosino, Director of the Justice and Prevention Research Center and Senior Research Associate with REL-NE, Trevor Fronius, a Senior Research Associate with REL-NE, and our discussant is Dr. Amy Fowler, Deputy Secretary of the Vermont Agency of Education. Kayleen Gould is also a Research Associate with REL-NE, and she is going to assist with the Q&A at the end. So I'm just going to turn over to the poll results from the waiting room. And so my colleague is going to bring those up. We'd just like to see what are some of the results. Looks like here they're just populating now. So we have a variety of folks on the webinar today, some from state-level organizations, the education agencies, SEAs, as well as majority are school administrators. We have a lot of researchers, as well as some other folks on the line, maybe some grad students in there. And then the second question, we asked whether you've collected or analyzed disciplinary data in your work, and overwhelmingly, the majority of you have, 76% or so, 73, 74, 75, it keeps changing. Have collected and analyzed disciplinary data in your work. So that's great that you have experience in this, and we're hoping that what you hear today will lend you some tips and further your understanding of in your efforts in analyzing and collecting disciplinary data. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony Petrosino, and he will begin section 1.
Well, thanks so much, Jessica. I really appreciate that, and great to be with everyone today. I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors. Well, of course, you heard from Trevor in a few minutes, Trevor Fronius and Kayleen Cook-Gould from the REL. Also, Herb Turner from Analytica, and a special shout out to Dan Lowson of the UCLA Project on Civil Rights, who is one of our co-authors and is considered by many people to be the foremost expert on disciplinary data, and we were really honored to have a chance to work with Dan on this report. So the importance of analyzing disciplinary data has really heightened in recent years. Much of this increased focus is due to a body of research that is emerging that suggests very strong correlations between exclusionary discipline like out-of-school suspension and outcomes for children like dropout and getting involved in the justice system. There's been a lot of research that shows that it's linked to poor academic performance and to increasing the number of students who end up out of school and involved in the juvenile justice system. We caution that this is correlation. We don't say that exclusionary punishment or discipline causes these outcomes, but the correlational evidence is obviously very, very, very strong. And it's obviously worth paying attention to, and so a lot of people are doing that. Oops, I'm having a little trouble trying to move the slide here. Okay, there we go. Another reason why analyzing disciplinary data is important is because of the equity considerations. Substantial research shows that certain subgroups, particularly racial and ethnic minorities and students with disabilities, are at greater risk for exclusionary punishment like out-of-school suspensions. What is most concerning from the research are the data that indicate, it's not on this slide, but if you dig into the data, that indicates the number of suspensions that racial and ethnic minorities receive for offenses that are sometimes considered very vague and subjective, like willful disrespect or disobedience. And I think that will come up a little bit later as well. So this gives you a little bit more information about the issues of equity. The data from civil rights in 2013-2014, which involves obviously a lot of schools and a lot of students, indicates that the disproportionality between black and white students, for example, regarding discipline starts very early in life, even in going down to preschool and all the way through K through 12. And the disparity is more so for boys, but it also exists for girls as well. This is a graph that our co-author, Dan Lowson, and his colleagues put together. And basically, it really shows in a nice visual way how the disparity has been growing over years for black students with regard to suspensions. In this case, I believe it's out-of-school suspensions, and the differences between black and then Latino and white students on this measure. So it has become, as you might imagine, the research on negative outcomes, the concern over disproportionality has led to a call for action, particularly by the federal government in 2014, which the Departments of Education and Department of Justice issued a Dear Colleague letter to schools and districts about the discipline issue and recommended that districts analyze their own data to understand the extent to which they're using exclusionary punishments like out-of-school suspensions and to the extent to which it's disproportionate among certain populations of students. So this report is, in some sense, was inspired by this guidance. Our goal was to produce a guide that would help districts in meeting these federal recommendations, but even beyond that, take steps to understand their disciplinary data to answer key questions. And those questions we'll be talking about throughout this webinar. What disciplinary actions do students receive and for what offenses? Are exclusionary disciplinary actions used more frequently for some subgroups than others? And do academic outcomes for these students differ by types of disciplinary actions they receive? These are not the only questions that one can answer, but regardless of the questions that you do ask, one must begin with some solid data checks. And for that discussion, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Trevor Fronius.
All right, thank you, Anthony, and thanks to everyone who's here today. You know, we're all here today to discuss how districts can examine their own data to assess how often they're using exclusionary disciplinary actions, and particularly for minor student offenses, whether policies or practices for addressing such infractions appear to be targeted towards certain types of students, and then also how these various disciplinary actions might correlate with academic outcomes. They're important questions that Anthony brought up here, but before we dive into the specific approaches to analyzing the data to examine the questions, there's some things that folks should consider and spend some time reviewing data to make the appropriate selections for the types of analyses you want to use. This review might include several considerations. There's actually a nice checklist of guiding questions in the report on page 5 and include questions such as, are the behaviors and disciplinary actions clearly defined? Do you know what your population of interest is or your unit of analysis? Are there defined rules for making sure that you're being transparent in your analysis, dealing with missing data appropriately or perhaps inaccurate data? And what is your process for checking the accuracy of the data and data entry process? And then also, what's your process or procedure for making sure that any potentially identifiable data is sufficiently suppressed so that we're not releasing data accidentally that would identify any students, specific students. So I'm going to walk through a few of the methods for completing these data checks here today, and I also point you to the report that includes in the appendix a much lengthier and detailed list of approaches for data checks for disciplinary data. But to start, let's define what we're talking about when we're referencing disciplinary action. It's defined many ways. Here we're looking at exclusionary and inclusionary discipline. Discipline in schools can be categorized as exclusionary actions which remove students from their normal learning setting. So an example would be out-of-school suspensions. Or inclusionary actions, which do not. That might be after-school detention or some other alternative. In-school suspension might be considered exclusionary or inclusionary because it still may result in that loss of learning time for the student. You can see in the report on page 2 and 3 an extensive list of definitions for these terms and others. But what's important here is that districts really should clearly define what their disciplinary actions are and how they relate to specific behavioral incidents and whether those actions are defined as exclusionary or inclusionary in order to fully analyze your disciplinary data. So there's really a wide range of student offenses for which they might be subject to disciplinary action. There's non-discretionary offenses that might require a very specific disciplinary action. For example, physical violence between students, fighting, or verbal threats. They might carry a very specific consequence or disciplinary action. But there are also these other types of offenses considered discretionary and are often categorized by these vague descriptors. So you can see in the table on the slide here, these are various ways districts within our Urban School Alliance define disrespect, defiance, and other kind of subjective student offenses. So you can see there's quite a variety here. The fact that these are subjective really allows for a lot of flexibility in how discipline is applied, but that flexibility in how discipline is applied to these offenses might also lead to the disproportionate use of discipline. So careful analysis of disciplinary data might unearth the frequency by which these offenses are met with various types of discipline and whether there are certain student subgroups disciplined more often than others for these subjective offenses. Okay. So we'll switch gears here and talk a little bit about the things you need in a data file in order to conduct the analyses that we're going to present here and that are presented in the REL report. The analyses that we'll follow here assume that you're working with what is called a flat file. Districts might extract disciplinary data from different sources or multiple data tables within the same data system, This is often what's referred to as relational data, coming from different sources. A flat file assumes that all the data are contained within the same file and that each row of data represents a single student and each column represents a single student variable, such as a single offense or resulting disciplinary action. When you're creating a flat file, you should really be thinking about your unit of analysis that you plan to use in your work. In this case, we're talking about student-level data, where each student is represented in a row, and that could be aggregated up to other levels, such as the school or the district. Once you have your flat file in place, it's time to start doing some of those data checks that we talked about a little while ago. So in addition to applying explicit definitions to all data elements in your analyses, and that includes the disciplinary actions, such as exclusionary and inclusionary, it's also important to establish some rules to make the analysis transparent. The rules might include how you define the population in your analysis or how you handle students who may have dropped out during the year or moved away from the district. Once you're clear on the data elements that are necessary and the rules that will guide the analysis, it's then important to confirm the extent and reasons for missing or potentially inaccurate data. So for example, there might be data that's not entered into the system at all. Now the issue with this is it provides an incomplete picture of offenses and discipline and can lead to misinterpretation of the data or potentially underestimates the frequency of either student offenses or the resulting disciplinary action. You also might come across data that's either collected or recorded incorrectly. Disciplinary data that can be incorrectly recorded if there's a wrong code for an offense that's used, or perhaps when data are copied in inaccurately from a paper form into the computer, and also when open-ended data are coded into discrete categories. So it's really important to do those data checks in the file that you have, and also talk with your colleagues and stakeholders that are entering the data into the system to identify potential areas for these issues with missing and inaccurate data. And then finally, again, it's important to establish the unit of analysis and ensure that the data is reported in a way that does not lead to potentially identifiable data. The an analyst interested in the number of suspensions in a school might use suspensions as the unit of analysis. Those interested in the number of students who are suspended would use the student as the unit analysis, and those would require two different data files. It really depends on what you're interested in. So the former is interested in the number of suspensions without regard for the number of students, while the latter is focused on the student, and each student is counted just once in the analysis regardless of the number of suspensions they receive. This is often referred to as unduplicated counts. So regardless of the unit of analysis, analysts will grapple with how to handle incidents with multiple offenses. So you might think of two students who are fighting, but then someone might be caught with a possession of a drug or something like that as part of the incident. How do we count that? Is it that there are two offenses for fighting and drugs? And how is that recorded within the data file? A common strategy is to count the incident only once and include the most serious offense within any incident that has multiple offenses. Again, you can refer to Appendix B of the report, which has an extensive set of data checks to help you further reduce the potential for error in your analyses. These include reviewing the coding and syntax for your analyses, making sure that you cross-check your disciplinary data and enrollment data between general education and special education students to be sure that things are being reported consistently across populations. And also take a look at the student identifiers in your file and make sure to reconcile any duplicate names, birth dates, anything like that to make sure you have accurate data on your students. There's a number of other suggestions, again, in Appendix B of the report. So from here, I'm going to turn it back to Anthony to start talking through some of those research questions that were posed a few slides ago.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Trevor. I appreciate that. And we're going to talk about those questions, and I'll talk about question number 1 that we provided some guidance for in the report, which is what disciplinary actions do students receive and for what offenses? And now, this is a critical question in trying to understand what's going on in the district. Even apart from disproportionality, you want to know what punishments being used, what disciplinary actions are being used in the district, and for what types of student offenses are students receiving these different actions, even apart from the question of what student populations they belong to. So this, our report kind of provides some guidance for that analysis. And interesting thing is that you can do an awful lot of these analyses with very simple, what we call cross tabulations. Very easy to do in any statistical software package. And the nice thing is that Trevor and the team have put together the syntax for SPSS is Appendix D, I believe, or Appendix E in the report, is all the syntax that you would need to run this in SPSS, and it's pretty straightforward to say also to sort of use it in other, similar syntax in other software programs. So it's a nice part of the guide. So there's a lot of different ways to go. We're not saying these are the only ways that you can analyze these data, but our goal is to provide somewhat of a blueprint and an organized, systematic way for thinking about this issue. So one question is that we might want to know how many students are receiving any disciplinary action at all. Now remember, and this is all on each of the table slides, is that these are fictitious data. So the data really don't have any meaning in of themselves. So I wouldn't try to interpret them because they're just fictitious for the point of illustrating the analysis. Now, a key thing that Trevor mentioned earlier on that can't be emphasized enough, and something I have to remind myself when I'm doing analyses, I don't do them as much as I used to, but is to really carefully define what we mean by certain what we call variables or factors like disciplinary action. What do we actually mean? What is actually incorporated into that when we say disciplinary action? What are all the actions that make up this very broad category? And so it's important to be explicit and transparent about how you're defining things, and then to be consistent using that same definition across different analyses so that the numbers are comparable. So this analysis here tells you very quickly how many students received at least one disciplinary action during the past academic year. And interesting enough, we don't talk about this in the report, but it establishes something of a district average. So if you were to analyze by each school in the district, you could see, well, who's using punishment more than, what schools are using punishment more than other schools, and, then it can lead to some further investigation. Okay. So then maybe we want to drill down a little bit deeper, and so our report then asks, the preceding slide asked how many students were disciplined, but the type of discipline that we were most concerned about when we looked at that data, the research that we showed early in the introduction, is the research on exclusionary punishments like out-of-school suspension, expulsion, and those kinds of things. And those are the types of punishments that the Department of Education and Department of Justice issued their guidance about. So they're asking districts to look at exclusionary punishment. This analysis looks at all students who were disciplined. How many of all the students who were disciplined, how many received an exclusionary disciplinary action? And again, we need to define what we mean by that and stick to that definition. So this table, the next table here, presents the results of analysis that drills down even more for more detail on exclusionary discipline. It breaks up exclusionary and inclusionary discipline, And then it begins to look at how many days, or at least breaks up a little bit, the number of days that a student was suspended if they received an out-of-school suspension. Because one of the emerging research trends right now is not just whether a student has been suspended or not, but how many days of instructional time have they lost. And so we get into the number of days a student has been suspended. And so this table presents the results of analysis that would help you get a little bit more refined. And of course you could add, instead of 1 day and more than 1 day, it could be 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and 4 more days. It could be broken up a little bit differently. But it would help us to get a little bit more at the loss of instructional time, which is becoming a key factor in research. Now, the final table in this section drills down even further. It's one thing to say students were suspended, but what were they suspended for? Again, a reminder that these are fictitious data. They may not match the reality in your districts or what you're familiar with, but they're just meant to illustrate the analysis. But it lays the groundwork later if you want to look at disciplinary actions for a specific offense for a specific student subgroup population. So you want to see are, say, black students and white students being punished differently for the same offense. It's a very important analysis. This lays the groundwork for that. And so I should note also in the preceding tables, what we had used was sort of the percentage of the total as the metric, as sort of the outcome in the table. This changes, the metric here has changed. Instead of percentage of the total students enrolled, or those who are disciplined, it's a rate per 100 students. It's just a way of building another comparable metric to be able to compare these different offense groups. And so it's one of the more common metrics in the analysis of disciplinary data. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over again to Trevor, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the metrics and then also analyzing analysis to unpack a little bit of the disproportionality of discipline issues.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. So Anthony just spoke to some extent about the extent to which students receive certain types of discipline in school and how this might vary by crime. Now, this is an important set of analyses. A district might use the results of these analyses and compare them with publicly available data to determine if the district is using exclusionary discipline at exceptionally high rates relative to other places. And that assumes that things are being measured in a similar fashion and using common definitions. I think further, these analyses will illuminate if there are certain types of offenses that are being targeted with exclusionary discipline, but maybe more appropriately addressed through other means of discipline. Again, talking about those subjective student offenses that we referenced a little while back. But what these analyses don't tell us is whether certain subgroups of students experience exclusionary discipline more frequently than others. The first step is really to determine what subgroups should be included in the analysis. Federal guidance recommends that districts focus on protected student subgroups. That might include by race and ethnicity, gender, or perhaps disability status. Now, for today and within the report, we focus on race and ethnicity as a protected student subgroup. But it's up to you as the analyst to work with the stakeholders to determine what analyses are most important for the examination you're interested in. All right. So the research question here, does the district use exclusionary disciplinary actions more frequently for some subgroups of students than others? We really, to answer this, need to consider a few things. In addition to identifying the appropriate student subgroup that we want to look at, in this case we're going to talk about race and ethnicity, we also need to produce enrollment frequency counts and percentages by these student subgroups. The enrollment totals are needed for the analyses that we'll discuss in a little bit. So in addition to the total student enrollment, you'll need to go back to your enrollment files and produce the same numbers for the subgroups that you're interested in analyzing. An additional step that you need to take is to determine what the risk index is, what risk index to use to determine whether there are disproportionate disciplinary actions towards certain student subgroups. There are many ways to present risk indices, and there's benefits and limitations to each, so we'll talk about that a bit. To start, you really should think about calculating the risk rate for the student population and subgroups of interest. Anthony talked a little bit about risk rate a few slides ago. The calculation for it is pretty straightforward. It's on page 2 of the report for those that have the report with them. But the rate itself does not provide a measure of disproportionality. This requires some measure of comparison. So from here, we're going to talk about turning the risk rate into various indices to examine disproportionality. We should also note that it's advisable to use multiple indices when you're conducting your analyses of disciplinary data. Again, each have limitations, and we'll briefly mention some of those limitations today. There's a more extensive discussion of those limitations and also benefits in the report, so I'd reference you there. But it's important to keep this in mind because under certain data conditions, only using one index could lead to a misinterpretation of the results. All right. So to start, let's take a look at the risk rate side by side. It's a simple risk index, and it comprises of the risk rates for certain student subgroups and allows you to visually compare the risk rates for each student subgroup in the analysis. So we can see it's a fairly intuitive set of numbers here where we are taking the total students that received any type of disciplinary action, perhaps exclusionary discipline, and dividing that by the total number of students enrolled within that subgroup and just multiplying it by 100 to create our risk rate, and then comparing those rates across the student subgroups visually. You can really take this a step further if you'd like to look at a more detailed risk index and disaggregate the results. For example, you could look at risk for suspension by race and ethnicity and also by disability status. So from here, we would take this data and extrapolate it out for the various student subgroups that you're interested in looking at. After you've calculated a risk index, it's just an easy extension to then look at risk differences and risk ratios. So we'll talk about those next. All right. So calculating risk differences. Gaps or differences in risk rates when we're using the risk index can be used to analyze disproportionality across subgroups simply by subtracting the risk rate from one student subgroup from the risk rate of another student subgroup. In this example, you see we're subtracting the risk rate for black students as it relates to out-of-school suspensions to the risk rate for white students. Again, I should note this is all fictitious data meant to be a visual example for you of the analyses. In this instance, the risk difference is 12.5 percentage points. Now, what's nice about risk differences, it provides a really clear comparison between the absolute percentage points for two groups. However, the measure is not sensitive to rare events. So, for example, if one subgroup had had a risk rate of 4% and another subgroup had a risk rate of 1%, the risk difference would only be 3 percentage points. But what we're talking about there is really a risk that's 4 times greater for one subgroup compared to another. So it's important to keep in mind the frequency of incidents when we're talking about these various indices. So risk differences speaks in absolute terms. Risk ratios, relative risk ratios, we're talking in relative terms. So to compare the relative differences rather than the absolute, A district might consider a relative rate ratio. To calculate the relative rate ratio, the risk rate for one student subgroup is divided by the rate of a second student subgroup. So here you can see we're using the same data to provide a relative risk ratio as compared to the risk difference. So from using the same data, we see that although there's the absolute difference of 12.5 percentage points, that's interpreted as a 2-to-1 relative risk ratio for black students compared to white students. Now, there are definitely some limitations to relative risk ratios, and we'll cover a few of them here. I think one considerable limitation is that relative risk ratios does not allow you to interpret if the underlying rates are exceptionally high or low. So the example that we provide in the slide here shows four cities or districts, and it's quite clear that City A uses exclusionary discipline much more frequently than City D, and yet the relative risk ratio for both cities is still just 2-to-1. This demonstrates that high ratios are possible even if the underlying risk is low. So this could be an issue if your goal is to discover whether large differences are driven by potentially excessive or unnecessary disciplinary action. Another limitation that should be fairly intuitive is because this is based on division, if the comparison subgroup has no suspended students, when we're talking about exclusionary discipline, the ratio simply cannot be calculated. So, this might affect elementary students, kindergarten students, settings and situations where you have really low numbers or potentially no data at all. And in that case, you may look back to the risk difference rather than the relative risk ratio. All right, something that Anthony mentioned a little while back, the disciplinary rate, and it's a fairly straightforward calculation. Here, it's simply just dividing the total number of disciplinary actions that the student subgroup received by the total enrollment for the student subgroup, and then multiplying it by 100. It makes it pretty straightforward to compare these rates across different subgroups by establishing a common denominator. All right. So the composition index. The composition index compares the percentage of a subgroup of students receiving a particular disciplinary action to the percentage of the total student enrollment. A composition index of 1, for example, indicates that a subgroup receives the same percentage disciplinary actions as its percentage total student enrollment. An index less than 1 indicates that subgroups receiving a lesser percentage, and an index greater than 1 indicates that the subgroup is receiving a greater percentage. So you can see in the slide here an example. So for white students, if they make up 40% of the population, but 60% of all students are suspended, the composition index would be 1.5. Again, there are some limitations to consider with this measure. For one, the measure is purely relative, so we cannot determine if the suspensions are frequent or rare, similar to their relative risk ratio. And because it is a purely relative value, each group can have equally disproportionate share of very different sized pies. This means that groups in different districts can be equally under or overrepresented, even though their risk for suspension in absolute terms is dramatically different. Another important limitation is a mathematical one. While some variation from the expected value is considered normal, Many use 20% increase over the expected value as a marker of problematic overrepresentation. However, for subgroups that represent 84% or more of the total enrollment, the calculation is not possible because 20% over 84 is greater than 100% of the population. So the composition index really should be considered a supplemental measure that should be used in conjunction with one or more of the other metrics presented today. All right. So now I'm going to briefly cover some other issues to consider when we're analyzing disciplinary data. One's the issue of small cell sizes. This is an issue that's always present, especially if you're looking at student subgroups. So for example, very few students in a subgroup of interest might be receiving a particular disciplinary action. One strategy for dealing with such a situation is to look at data over multiple years to see if there's patterns that emerge, and also talk to your stakeholders and folks in the district to gather context that might shed light on these issues. And then also when we're talking about small cell sizes, again, I remind you that it might identify specific students. So in this case, the data really should not be reported publicly in order to avoid FERPA violations. All right. Now using risk rate to explore disproportionality. So beyond comparing groups to explore disproportionate use of exclusionary discipline, districts may be interested in the relationship between student characteristics and the use of different types of discipline. The fictitious data here indicate that Black and Hispanic students receive both in-school and out-of-school suspensions at a higher rate than do white students. You might also be interested in further exploring this by different types of offenses. So to do this, we break it out both by subgroup of students and also subgroups of disciplinary offenses. A consideration here is how to include the incidents in which students are accused of committing multiple offenses. Again, maybe just go with that most serious offense that's committed. And what we can see here in the example on the slide is that white students have the lowest rate of out-of-school suspensions and the highest rate of in-school suspensions for the student offense category of attacks, threats, or fighting. All right. Now finally, we're going to take a look at the third research question presented in the report, and that relates to the resulting academic outcomes and how those might differ by the types of disciplinary actions that students receive. All right, so we know that there's federal guidance that recommends all districts determine the frequency of exclusionary discipline and whether it is disproportionate among certain student subgroups. But districts shouldn't stop there. They're not limited to that. You could go beyond those questions to ask more about the relationship between these disciplinary actions and subsequent outcomes. To do this, and Anthony discussed it early on in the presentation, you could use just a simple cross-tabulation to really begin to understand this relationship. So on the slide here, we see that among students who receive at least one out-of-school suspension, almost 20% did not advance to the next grade, compared to 6.1% of students who did not receive any type of discipline. Crosstabs are appropriate for categorical data, so here we're talking about data that can be organized into subgroups like student, race, and ethnicity, and letter grades, but you can also take continuous data like age or test scores and collapse it into meaningful categories for analysis. The report goes on to describe some other types of analyses to do to look at the associations and correlations between types of discipline that's used and various potential outcomes. So I point you to the report to take a more extensive look at that. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Amy Fowler, to provide a little more perspective on Vermont and how they've been dealing with disciplinary data. So I'll hand it over to you, Amy.
Thank you. So first, I've been reading the chats and everything that people are writing. I can tell we have lots of different people in different roles. So I think I'm going to direct my comments more to those of you that are working in schools, in districts, or at SEAs versus researchers or those who are analyzing this information for other purposes. I think one of the things that both Anthony and Trevor have brought up is the importance of really understanding what your data has and what kinds of meaning you can make from it. Our experience in Vermont is that every question that we ask of the data, it leads to another question. So Ricky, you asked, how long does this whole process take from when you start cleaning the data to when you analyze it and you have a report? And my answer is it never ends. And I'm positive that's not what you hope to hear, but when we start with a research question, we can usually come up with an answer to the first question pretty quickly after we've done some cleaning. But it always leads to a, well, what about this, and how about if we look at it this way, and what if we do this other cross-tab of some kind? So what we have found is once we started down the path of analyzing the data, it's actually fairly open-ended. And so I think my advice to you, for those of you that are working in the field, is to really think about what your capacity is for action for the research question that you're going to ask. You don't have unlimited time and energy, and so you have to really focus your efforts on the best places to work towards improvement. So in Vermont, we use this data primarily to understand the context of exclusionary discipline in our state. And we've been thinking carefully about the policy considerations that we have. So I think one of the questions that came up from Clara was about, like, how do you define what's extremely high? And we didn't know when we started out what would be an extremely high disproportionate level for any student group. And so we had to first look at the data and then say, you know what, among some of our schools, there's a disproportionality rate that's 2 or 3 times exclusionary rates for students with disabilities or students on free and reduced lunch to others. That's where we need to focus our attention. But there were other places where it was 1.5 times, and that was equally troubling. But we had to triage our efforts and decide where to support folks. So I don't know if that's helpful. Excuse me. Also, Jessica, you raised a question about how small is too small. Well, every state and every district should have guidelines for you related to how you protect student privacy related to FERPA. In Vermont, we use a minimum N of 11 for reporting any data. Our schools are incredibly small, and our diversity is not very high. This means that in many of our reports, we end up suppressing data. And I will make sure to send to the REL a link to our Vermont discipline report for those of you who'd like to see what that suppressed data looks like in action. But then the last thing I think that's really important is before you sit down to look at this data is to think about what are you going to do with your data once you get it. And in most cases, if you're at a district level or a school level, the data you're using is likely not the civil rights data collection. It's some kind of data collection tool that you have for collecting the information about exclusions or any kind of discipline. I think one of the very first questions you want to ask yourself is, what kind of data and guidance have you given to your folks who do the data entry to know whether or not you're capturing all disciplinary actions, or is it just when a student is suspended? So in my state, we've only required that school districts put in data when the student misses school. We don't require it when they decide on some other consequence. So I can't actually ever tell someone if kids are getting suspended more frequently than they're not getting suspended, because quite frankly, I don't know anything about the times they've committed an infraction and didn't get suspended. I only know for certain when they have. So you just have to be really careful with that. And what we found related to what Trevor was speaking about in cleaning the data is we had a lot of errors in data entry that we only discovered because we were doing our reports. So for example, one of the things that we discovered is the vast majority of our suspensions were for something called violating school rules. Well, we found out after we sat down with our school folks The reason why that was happening was for 3 reasons. One, it was the very first thing they saw, so they didn't do a drop-down menu to look at all the choices. The second is that they liked it because they could fill in text describing what happened, and the other choices didn't let them fill in any other text. So we changed the way the data collection tool works so that you can actually enter in data. And we changed the first thing you see literally to murder, which is a suspendable offense, not something you think about every day. But that's so rare that it forced people to open up the menu and see all of the other choices. And then the third thing that happened was what Trevor was referencing is that when there are multiple infractions related to a single incident, the school folks were having a hard time deciding. So a student has had a fight, they have a weapon, and they're also caught with drugs, and they intimidate a witness. They chose violate school rules because all 4 of those things violate school rules. It seemed like a good choice. But what we said was, no, actually, what's the precipitating reason that you are suspending the student? Select that one and then use that from there. So we provided additional training. Then the last thing that I would say is, I think that if your goal is to help people improve their discipline at their school so that you have support for a healthy learning environment, but also reduce any kind of impact of implicit bias or racism or sexism to others, you need to really balance how you look at the data. Jawan's been chatting a bit about the concern that sometimes schools stop suspending students because they're worried about what the statistics will look like, but it's actually leading to a disruption in school climate. Super important that as you're working with your schools, with your principals, your assistant principals, whoever is responsible for these decisions, that you're maintaining the obligation of the school to both provide a supportive learning environment for all kids, but also really address the ways in which they may be doing this disproportionately and in ways that harm kids. So I hope that that's helpful to you, and I believe we're moving on to questions.
So thank you so much, Amy. That was wonderful. This is Kayleen Gould, and I'm one of the researchers who contributed a bit to the report. Thank you so much, everyone, for asking so many questions in the chat. If additional questions come up, please feel free to enter them as well. One of the questions that we got from Michael, Brenda, and Betsy referred to the difference between inclusionary versus exclusionary discipline and in-school suspension versus out-of-school suspension. Anthony and Trevor, would you like to answer that question, how to sort of distinguish between those terms?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Kayleen. This is Trevor here. I think it's a great question, and it highlights the fact that schools, districts, and states have a variety of ways that they define specific types of disciplinary actions, and the way those are defined and used within the school will result in variation in how they're categorized as exclusionary or inclusionary. So I think that the basic definition would be that exclusionary discipline would be an action that results in loss of learning time for a student. And that very well could include in-school suspensions in many cases. I think we've had a conversation with Amy about that, and that's how many districts in the state define it in Vermont. But there are other districts that may use different approaches to in-school suspension that preserve learning time for those students. Say it's a half-day in-school suspension, and they may be moved to another setting within the school, but still maintaining learning time. So it's a definitional issue, and it's one that you should be really clear on in your own data and understand how it relates to the federal reporting guidelines. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Trevor. So another question that we got from Lisa referred to repeat offenders, and Amy talked a little bit about this sort of when she was discussing the way that actions and incidents are sort of characterized. But Lisa asked if a student has multiple discipline incidents on different dates, would they all be included? And is there some analysis that looks at repeat offenders or the proportion of discipline incidents by repeater versus non-repeaters?
So I don't know go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Kaylee, and I'll take a go at that one as well. So to answer the first part of the question, if there are multiple disciplinary incidents on different dates, would they all be included? What I would suggest is think about your unit of analysis and whether or not you want to include duplicated or unduplicated counts in the data. So if we're talking about the number of students who were suspended, regardless of the number of times they were suspended, if a student has multiple incidents on different days and those incidents all result in a exclusionary disciplinary action, you may only count that once if you're talking about unduplicated counts of students. But it may be that you count them multiple times if we're interested in the total number of suspensions. So you would think about your unit of analysis there. Terrific question about repeat versus non-repeat offenders. Oftentimes, you might want to include other types of student characteristics in your analyses when you're doing cross tabulations. One of those could be repeat and non-repeat offenders and see whether or not those relate to either different outcomes or different types of disciplinary action. So I suggest you could create a flag for that, a simple 0, 1, to indicate if a student had been a repeat offender, and include that type of data in your analysis. It's a great thought, and hopefully that helps answer the question.
And if I can add, could I add, Kayleen? I think that this is really where it's important to know what your policy question is that you're trying to address. And so if what you are interested in, out of all the students in my school, how many have experienced an exclusionary discipline event, then you want to use that unduplicated count because you're looking for, in this past year, how many students have had this experience. If your research question is more, how frequently are students who are of a particular group experiencing an out-of-school exclusion, or a disciplinary exclusion, then you might look at that duplicated count because that's going to get to the frequency with which it occurs to that particular group. But you really have to think about the policy question and what your next steps will be moving forward. And I suspect from what I saw in the poll that some of you are actually doing the data crunching for your school, your district, or your state. And others of you are more going to lead the professional development or the support to about how to address the problem. It's important that those two people are talking together, if it's not the same person, in order to make sure that the data is actually going to push you towards some way of improving situations for students, because otherwise you're just studying data to admire the problem, but we all want to use that data in order to improve.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was very helpful. I think that we only have time for one more question. We did get 2 questions referring to risk rate. One was from Clara asking what defines extremely high rates, and then we got a question from Jessica asking what is the difference between looking at rate per 100 students versus percent.
Hey, Kayleen, this is Trevor here again. Great questions. I think, and you might be able to speak to the other one better than I, but in terms of defining exceptionally high rates, if we're talking about rates relative between student subgroups, a figure that is commonly used is maybe a 20% difference between the rates of disciplinary action and the overall student population. But also think about your student population. You could have a school that uses relatively low exclusionary discipline overall, but still disproportionate across student subgroups. You could have a school that uses exceptionally high exclusionary discipline and that are relatively proportionate across subgroups. I think in context, and then it would be a good way to go about that. And I think Amy's also pointing to their recent report from Vermont. She shared it in the chat. The difference between rates and percentages is somewhat nuanced. I think we're actually out of time, but I'm happy to follow up if maybe Kayleen can provide the participant. I'm sorry about that.
Thanks, Trevor. No, that was, I should have realized we were so close on time. I will hand it over now to Ashley to wrap us up.
Hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today and participating in this webinar. Today's webinar recording will be archived and uploaded to IES YouTube channel. You will receive an email from us with a link to the webinar archive when it is ready. We will also be producing a Q&A document that we will post to our website or share with you that will have all the questions from today's webinar and written answers, responses for your future use. So thank you again for participating and have a wonderful afternoon.